Deep in the woods, far from any sign of civilization, there was an old, decaying asylum. The building, once a bustling mental hospital, had been abandoned for over 3 decades. It was said to be cursed, haunted by the spirits of those who had perished within its walls. Most locals avoided the area, whispering stories of strange noises and flickering lights. But for a group of curious urban explorers, this was the ultimate challenge. They had heard the rumors about the place for years, but they couldn't resist. Equipped with flashlights, cameras, and a sense of adventure, they set out one chilly evening to explore the forgotten asylum. The tall iron gates were rusted, barely hanging on their hinges, but the explorers managed to push through. Their footsteps echoed through the empty courtyard, where overgrown vines snaked up the walls of the building. The air felt thick, almost oppressive, and the further they ventured, the more unsettling it became. As they stepped inside, they were met with a heavy silence. The air was musty, filled with the stench of mold and decay. The walls were cracked, and the floors creaked beneath their weight. The explorers began to split up, each taking a different wing of the asylum to document the place. They expected a few odd noises, maybe some eerie pictures, but nothing could prepare them for what lay ahead. In one wing, the group found old patient records scattered across a room. The papers were yellowed with age, and the handwriting on them was almost illegible. But there were disturbing notes, patients listed with terrifying conditions, some of them labeled as hopeless, unmanageable, or dangerous. One document even detailed a patient's escape attempt, but the rest of the paper was stained with something dark, as if the writer hadn't wanted to remember what had happened. Meanwhile, the others ventured deeper into the asylum's maze-like hallways. One of the explorers, a woman named Emily, discovered a large locked door at the end of a corridor. She managed to pry it open, revealing a dark, narrow staircase leading down. The air grew colder as she descended, the smell of rotting wood and rust hanging in the air. At the bottom, she found a hidden room, an old operating theater with rusted surgical tools scattered across the floor and a blood-stained table at the center. Suddenly, a sharp, guttural sound echoed from somewhere above them. The group froze, their hearts pounding. It was a slow, dragging noise, as though something heavy was being dragged across the floor. The sound was coming closer. They hurried to meet back in the main hallway, but by the time they reunited, things were different. The air was colder, and the silence had become suffocating. Emily's flashlight flickered and then died, casting her into darkness. The others' lights seemed to grow dim as well, as though something was draining them. In the dark, they heard the sounds of footsteps, slow, deliberate, and uneven, coming from somewhere deep within the asylum. "Did you hear that?" whispered one of the explorers, a young man named Mark. But the others had heard it too, soft whispers like the wind, but far too distinct. The air felt thick with a presence, something unseen, and it made their skin crawl. Then came the banging. It echoed through the halls, like doors slamming open and shut. Panic set in, and they scrambled to find an exit. But the asylum seemed to twist around them. Hallways that should have led to doors turned into dead ends, and rooms they'd already passed through now looked different, as if the building itself was alive, shifting to trap them. As they reached what they thought was the front door, they found it locked. Behind them, the sound of something or someone was getting closer. It was no longer just footsteps. The floorboards creaked with each movement, but no one was there. The whispers grew louder, turning into voices, familiar voices, voices of patients that had died in that place. One of the explorers, the last to remain calm, shouted, "Get to the basement! There's an escape tunnel!" They rushed down the stairs again, but as they reached the bottom, the door slammed shut behind them. It was pitch black. The walls seemed to close in on them. Then, from the corner of the room, a flickering light appeared, faint at first, but growing brighter. The light led them to a small opening in the wall, just big enough for them to crawl through. They took a deep breath and scrambled through, one by one, only to find themselves outside, but the air didn't feel like fresh air. The world around them was wrong. The trees were twisted, and the sky had an unnatural hue, like they had stepped into another dimension. The asylum loomed behind them, its windows dark and empty, but they could still hear the echoes of whispers calling their names, urging them to come back. They ran, but the further they went, the more disoriented they became. It was as if the very land was changing, warping around them. After what felt like hours, they finally found the road, and with it, the promise of safety. But as they looked back, the asylum was gone. The land had returned to its natural state, as if nothing had ever been there. They never spoke of what happened that night, but each of them knew that whatever had been in that asylum was not just the spirits of the dead. It was something much darker, something ancient, and it was still watching, still waiting for the next unwitting souls to enter its cursed hall.
Story number 2.
There was a small, abandoned village tucked away in a remote corner of the country. It had been deserted for over 50 years, with only the occasional hiker or urban explorer daring to venture near. The houses stood in ruin, their windows shattered, and the streets cracked with age. It had been a place where people once lived, until something happened that drove everyone away, something no one spoke about. The locals who still lived nearby would always give wary glances when asked about the village, warning others never to set foot there. But that didn't stop a group of young friends from wanting to explore it. The group arrived at the edge of the village just as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the broken homes. A sense of dread settled over them as they stepped off the road and into the desolate streets. Everything was eerily quiet, save for the soft rustling of dead leaves carried by a wind that never seemed to stop. The homes, once quaint cottages, were now nothing more than shells, fallen roofs, rotting wood, and abandoned furniture that had long been forgotten. One of the friends, Sarah, led the group to the town's old church, its bell tower now a crooked silhouette against the darkening sky. The church had been the heart of the village once, but now it stood as a monument to the unknown tragedy that had driven the people away. As they approached, a cold breeze seemed to whip through them, sending shivers down their spines. Inside, the air was thick with dust, and the smell of mildew lingered. The group's flashlights cut through the dark, revealing peeling paint and stained pews. But something else caught their eye, a massive altar at the front of the church, covered in strange symbols and bloodstains. The floor was uneven, and as Sarah stepped closer to investigate, her foot struck something metal beneath the floorboards. Curious, they pried up the boards to reveal a rusted iron trapdoor. Hesitant but eager, they pulled it open, revealing a staircase that descended into complete darkness. Despite the overwhelming sense of unease that gripped them, they decided to venture down. The stairs creaked under their weight, the sound like an old man's bones cracking. The air grew colder as they descended, the temperature dropping rapidly until their breath came out in visible puffs. At the bottom of the stairs, they found a stone chamber. It was large and empty, save for a series of old wooden crates scattered along the walls. But as they moved deeper into the room, a faint scratching noise began. It was soft at first, barely audible, but it grew louder, coming from somewhere in the corner of the room. One of the friends, Mark, cautiously approached the sound, his flashlight trembling in his hand. The scratching stopped abruptly as his beam landed on a dark figure hunched in the corner. At first, they thought it was a pile of rags, but when the light shone brighter, they realized it was a person, barely recognizable. The figure was gaunt, covered in dirt and dried blood, its eyes wide and bloodshot, staring back at them with an expression of pure terror. The friends froze. The figure's lips began to move, but no sound came out. Then, in a voice that echoed in their minds, it whispered, "Get out! They're coming!" Before they could react, the air grew heavy with an unnatural pressure. The walls seemed to close in around them, and the room began to shake violently. The ground beneath their feet cracked, and a low, guttural growl rumbled from below. From the depths of the earth, a horrible, monstrous shape began to rise, its twisted limbs scraping the walls, its body covered in writhing shadows. The creature's eyes gleamed with malice, and its jagged teeth glistened in the dim light. Panic set in. The friends scrambled to the stairs, but they found themselves unable to move fast enough. The growling grew louder, now accompanied by the sound of something slithering, something following them up the stairs. As they reached the trapdoor, Mark was pulled back into the darkness, his scream echoing in the chamber as something dragged him down into the abyss. The remaining friends bolted out of the church, their hearts pounding, but the village wasn't the same as before. The buildings, once decayed and empty, now seemed to have life. A soft moaning sound filled the air as they fled, the sky above them turning an unnatural shade of black. They ran until they could no longer see the village in the distance, but even then, the feeling of being watched didn't fade. The next morning, when they returned to the site, the village was completely gone. There were no remnants of the church, no crumbling houses, not even the trees they had passed on their way in. It was as if it had never existed. The only trace left was the faint, scratching noise they could still hear, echoing in their minds. To this day, no one knows what happened in that village, but those who dare to search for it never return the same. Some say they find themselves lost, walking in circles, unable to escape the village that now exists only in their nightmares. Others claim to have seen the figure that once whispered in the dark, its eyes following them wherever they go, urging them to join those who had never left. And the scratching, it never stops. It waits just beneath the earth for the next soul to wander too close.
Story number 3.
In a remote town nestled between dense forests, there was a house that everyone avoided. It was a large, looming structure, its windows like hollow eyes staring out onto the street. No one knew its true history, but the townspeople knew that anyone who had lived there never lasted long. People spoke in hushed tones about the house, saying it was cursed, haunted by something darker than just the restless souls of its past occupants. One evening, a young couple, desperate to escape the hustle of city life, moved into the house, unaware of its terrible past. They were looking for peace, a quiet place to start fresh. At first, it seemed perfect. The house was old, yes, but it was full of charm and character. There were creaking floorboards and the occasional draft, but nothing that seemed out of the ordinary. But as the days passed, things began to feel wrong. At night, the house was unnaturally cold, no matter how much they adjusted the thermostat. Strange whispers seemed to drift through the air, and sometimes, when they'd look into the dark corners of a room, they thought they saw something moving in the shadows. Just a flicker of motion that would disappear as soon as they blinked. One night, they were woken by a loud bang, like something heavy falling to the floor. The couple rushed into the hallway, only to find the source of the noise. A large, antique mirror had fallen off the wall, but the odd thing was that it wasn't cracked. The glass was intact, reflecting the couple's faces, but when they looked closer, they saw something else. A figure standing behind them, just beyond the frame of the mirror. The figure was a woman, dressed in an old-fashioned gown, her eyes hollow and dark. She stood motionless, staring directly at them. The couple turned around in a flash, but no one was there. The mirror was empty. They tried to convince themselves it was just a trick of the light, but as the night wore on, the whispers grew louder, more urgent, as if the house itself was alive, trying to communicate with them. Then came the dreams. Every night, the couple dreamed of the same woman, tall, gaunt, with long black hair that seemed to move as though it had a life of its own. In their dreams, the woman would reach out toward them, her hands cold as ice, her voice a raspy whisper calling their names. "Come closer," she would say. "You belong to me now." The woman's face was always obscured, but something about her seemed familiar, as if they had seen her before. They couldn't shake the feeling that she was beckoning them, drawing them deeper into her world. One night, the woman finally spoke clearly, her voice cutting through the dream with a chilling finality. "You cannot leave." The next morning, the couple found themselves growing weaker. Neither of them could sleep properly, and when they tried to leave the house, they found they couldn't bring themselves to do so. It was as if something was holding them back, keeping them within the walls of the house. When they looked in the mirror, they saw it again, the woman's figure, standing just behind them. Terrified, they began to research the history of the house. They discovered that decades ago, a woman had lived there, a widow with a young daughter. The woman had died under mysterious circumstances, and her daughter, too, had vanished. Some believed the mother's spirit had never left, but others whispered that something darker had taken hold of the house, that the woman had made a pact with an ancient entity, offering up her soul in exchange for power. As the couple read further, they discovered a chilling detail. The house was built on the ruins of an old burial ground where sacrifices had been made in ancient rituals. The woman's spirit was no longer just a restless soul. It had become something else entirely, a vessel for something far more malevolent. One evening, desperate to escape, the couple packed their things and tried to leave, but the door wouldn't open. The walls seemed to close in on them, the air thick with a suffocating force that made it hard to breathe. The mirror in the hallway cracked, and from the broken glass emerged the figure of the woman, her hollow eyes now wide open, her mouth stretching impossibly wide as she screamed in a voice that tore at their sanity. In a final, desperate bid, the couple ran for the back door. But when they stepped outside, they found themselves not in the yard, but standing in front of the house once again. They had gone in a circle, trapped in the house's dark power. That was the last time anyone saw them. The house stood empty once again, but the whispers continued, just beneath the surface, faintly echoing into the night. Some say the couple was never meant to leave, that they are still trapped within the walls, their souls bound to the mirror, forever haunted by the woman's twisted presence. To this day, the house remains, a silent monument to the evil that lurks within. And if you ever find yourself walking near the edge of that town, you might just hear a voice, faint and soft, whispering your name, urging you to come closer. But remember, if you answer, it might be the last thing you ever do.
Story number 4.
There's a town in the middle of nowhere, a place that's not on most maps. The locals call it Whisper Hollow. It's a small community, isolated from the rest of the world by thick woods and steep hills, but what really makes the place unsettling is the cemetery at the edge of town. It's old, far older than the town itself. The gravestones are cracked and weathered, the inscriptions faded and nearly unreadable. People say the cemetery is cursed, abandoned by time, and that the spirits buried there are not at rest. One day, a traveler, a man named Jack, wandered into Whisper Hollow. He was a drifter, moving from town to town looking for work. He was running low on money and thought the town might have something for him. As he approached, he saw the cemetery off in the distance, and something about it gave him an uneasy feeling. But it was just an old graveyard, he thought. Nothing unusual. He was wrong. Jack entered the town and stopped at a small diner where he ordered a coffee and spoke to the waitress, an elderly woman who eyed him suspiciously. As he paid, he asked her if there was any work in town. She didn't answer immediately, but instead glanced out the window as if searching for something in the distance. When she spoke, her voice was low and cautionary. "You're not from around here," she said, her eyes narrowing. "You might want to leave while you still can." Jack laughed, thinking she was just being quirky. "I'm just passing through. I'll be gone tomorrow." The waitress didn't smile. "People who stay here too long, they don't leave." Curious, Jack decided to stay the night. The town was quiet, and he figured he could sleep in the small inn on the outskirts. That night, when he lay in his bed, sleep wouldn't come. The air felt thick, heavy, and he kept hearing the faintest whispers outside his window. Thinking it was just the wind, he tried to ignore it, but the whispers grew louder, clearer. Jack tried to pull the covers over his head, but they weren't just whispers anymore. They were voices, soft, pleading, desperate. "Help me," the voices cried as if from deep underground. "Please, let us rest." Jack's heart raced as he sat up in bed, sweat trickling down his face. The room grew cold. He grabbed the flashlight on his nightstand and stumbled toward the window, throwing open the curtains. He froze. There, in the graveyard near the edge of town, he saw figures moving among the tombstones. Tall, thin shapes with hollow eyes and tattered clothes, slowly shuffling through the graves. Their faces were pale and gaunt, and their skin hung loosely from their bones. They moved without sound, like shadows, as if the moonlight itself couldn't touch them. But most unsettling of all were their eyes, dark, endless pits that seemed to look straight through him. Jack backed away from the window, at his heart pounding. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. Was it a hallucination? Or had the town's eerie reputation gotten to his head? The whispers continued, louder now, echoing through the room. "Come find us. We are waiting." Unable to ignore it any longer, Jack rushed out of the inn, the cold night air biting at his skin. He made his way to the cemetery, his steps quick and erratic, as if something was urging him on. The grave seemed to loom larger as he approached, the air growing heavier with every step. The figures were still there, now more distinct, their forms taking shape under the moonlight. They moved in slow circles around a central point in the graveyard, a stone monument Jack hadn't noticed before. When he reached the center of the cemetery, he felt a strange pull toward the monument. It was an ancient stone, covered in moss and vines, but there were strange markings carved into its surface, symbols Jack had never seen before. As his fingers brushed against the stone, the ground beneath him began to tremble. He heard a faint scraping sound, like something moving underground. Suddenly, the earth cracked open beneath the monument, and from the depths a hand emerged, long and thin, with fingers like twisted roots. Jack stumbled backward in shock, but the hand reached out, grabbing his ankle with a vice-like grip. The figures in the graveyard, now more like twisted, skeletal beings, closed in around him, their hollow eyes burning with hunger. He tried to scream, but no sound came. The hand pulled harder, dragging him toward the opening in the earth. As he was pulled closer, he saw the faces of the figures, now fully visible in the moonlight. They were the souls of those buried in the cemetery, their bodies long decomposed, but their souls still trapped, unable to rest. They were angry. They were starving, and they wanted him. In that moment, Jack realized what the waitress had meant. The town wasn't just haunted by the dead, it was cursed by them. Those who stayed too long were never allowed to leave. They became part of the cemetery, forever trapped in the earth, wandering alongside the restless souls that had never found peace. The last thing Jack saw before the ground swallowed him was the faces of the dead, eyes empty and black, mouths twisted in screams. And then there was nothing but darkness. The next morning, the townspeople found the inn empty, with Jack's belongings scattered across the floor. They didn't speak of it, but they knew what had happened. The cemetery claimed another soul, another lost traveler who had stayed too long. To this day, travelers who venture too close to Whisper Hollow can hear the faint sound of whispers in the wind. If you listen closely enough, you can hear them calling your name, beckoning you toward the cemetery, where you'll find yourself lost among the graves, never to leave.